Why am I wearing my rock and roll hat? Because myself, Judith, and Patrick, co hosts with major music people, are paying tribute tonight to Seymour Stein, a music legend. Your co hosts, myself, Spencer Drate, with Judith Salavetz, designed for major artists on Sire Records Ramones, Talking Heads, Lou Reed, The Velvet Underground, etc. These albums and 45s are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Lou Reed NYPL, MoMA, and AIGA archival collections, plus museum shows. We have a Spencer for Sire, which is an interview with me on our Sire Records design, attached to this interview if anybody wants to see it. Before I start introducing those paying tribute, besides myself and Judith, I would like to tell you some of Seymour Stein's legendary bio. I call Seymour Stein the sire of punk and new wave. We are paying tribute to a music legend, Seymour Stein, a music executive, co founder, Sire Records, and vice president of Warner Records, co founded and president for many years of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and inducted in the Rock Hall. His book, Sire's Song My Life in Music, is the autobiography of America's greatest living visionary record man, published in 2018 by St. Martin's Press. He signed some of the most famous, iconic artists on Sire Records: Cyndi Lauper, Madonna, Ramones, Talking Heads, Dead Boys, Debbie Harry, The Smiths, The Pretenders, the Paley Brothers, Lou Reed, Velvet Underground, Katie Lang, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, Plastic Bertrand, Depeche Mode, Ice-T, The Smiths, so on and so on. Artists on Sire Records inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame were Madonna, Ramones, Talking Heads, Lou Reed, The Velvet Underground, and The Pretenders. In 2013 CBGB event, Seymour was given an Icon Award that we attended. In 2012, Billboard gave Seymour again an Icon Award. Ice-T said about Seymour in Siren Song a great quote. He is cut from the cloth of the old time music executives like Clive Davis, but he's way more eccentric, a bit more avant garde, more of an edgy cat. I was a designer for Sire Records several years. Seymour plus art director John Gillespie gave me and later me with Judith the opportunity to design albums 45 for some of the most iconic artists on Sire Records. Seymour was a springboard of our legendary Album 45 career. He let us create what we wanted on those album covers of 45s. He was a visionary mentor in our life. Fear of Music was nominated for the best album packaging. It was in a MoMA show and the MoMA permanent collection, which I co-designed with Talking Heads. In our book, 545s, we displayed Sire 45 sleeves, Ramones, Talking Heads, Richard Hell, Dead Boys. In the visual history of music, Sire must be included. Seymour saw the vision. I mentioned Seymour that I designed with John Holmstrom doing the artwork. Ramones' Road to Ruin, a Point of Purchase USA poster, was selected for the MoMA permanent collection, a great honor. He immediately replied to me, Spencer, you were one of the few people that believed in the Ramones. This shows that Seymour was very passionate about not only his artists, but the people who supported his artists. I want to also make note of Seymour's family. His wife, Linda Stein, who introduced me to Danny, who catapulted my Ramones album cover career. She launched careers in Madonna, Ramones, Talking Heads, and The Pretenders. And Seymour's daughter, Samantha, was also a great supporter of him. Mandy Stein, his daughter, was a producer, director, filmmaker. Some of them, Too Tough to Die, a tribute to Johnny Ramone in 2006. Burning Down the House, Story of CBGB's in 2009. Co-producer of Velvet Underground film by Todd Haynes in 2021. After all that, let's introduce our guests. Richard Gottehrer, America's songwriter, record producer, and record label executive, co-founder of Sire Records in 1966. On Sire, he launched careers of Madonna, Ramones, Talking Heads, Richard Hell. He was also, I believe, the producer of Richard Hell and the Voidoids' Blank Generation, one of the most famous punk albums on Sire. Marty Scott, founder and former president of Jem Records, launching careers of many UK and domestic artists. Jem was the parent company of Passport Records. Jem was resurrected in 2013 as Jem Recording. Richard Barone, America rock musician, front of the Bongos, songwriter, arranger, author of his present book, Music and Revolution, which everybody must buy. Director, record producer, releases albums as a solo artist, creating events at Carnegie Hall, Hollywood Bowl, New York City Central Park. He served on the board of governors of the Recording Academy Grammys, and he serves on the advisory board of the Anthology Film Archives. Welcome to our show, and let's start. Richard, guess we'll start with you, Richard Gottehrer.
Oh, sure. Hi. Well, I have fond memories of Seymour. I mean, I remember I first met him in the Brill Building, coming down the elevator, and we just started talking. And what we talked about was the fact that at that time, Seymour was doing independent promotion. He had a way of understanding how records could be promoted. I'll say it that way. And basically, he had been engaged by Bang Records to produce a record that we had produced, Hang On Sloopy. And there were other versions of Hang On Sloopy out of My Girl Sloopy. We changed it and called it Hang On Sloopy. And somehow the other records disappeared from the Billboard charts, and the Bang Records of Hang On Sloopy rose to prominence, eventually to number one. And we became friends. And then I was coming to the end of the writing period with Bob and Jerry. And Seymour and I decided to go into business as a production company. We called it Sire, which is S for the first letter of Seymour, I for the second letter of Richard, R for the first letter of Richard, E for the second letter of Seymour, SIRE.
Wow.
And we didn't invest any money in designs. We didn't know you at the time. So we just took the Lowenbrow beer bottle. So the first Sire is the lion rising up like that. That's on the bottle of Lowenbrow beer. And then we went on and we became a production company and then a record company that was distributed by London Records. And we made some recordings sort of copying the growth of Electra, folk records that didn't cost too much money to make. And we did some really good ones. But what we really did was we started going overseas. And the change had just happened from AM radio to the FM signal. And albums were being produced in the UK and across Europe, but they weren't being released here. The export divisions of the large major record companies wanted the records to come out here, but the American counterparts were not willing to release them. Example would be the Beatles. There were 3 singles out on other labels before Capitol had the wisdom to say, hey, let's take a chance with these guys. So Seymour and I would go, I'll be quick with this, and then you guys can pick up. Seymour and I would go to the UK. We'd visit the export divisions, but we would bring with us something that I used to send to radio stations when I wanted them to play the records, Jewish cheesecakes. From New York. I would send cheesecakes. We would send. So we took about a dozen cheesecakes, packed them in dry ice, and would go to the export divisions and talk to them. And say, here's a gift for you. The next time we came back, maybe a couple of months later, say the UK EMI, for example, they'd say, "Hey, did you bring the cheesecakes? They were great." I said, "Sure, here's another one. What do you have for us?" And what they had for us was good music. The Climax Blues Band, Barclay James Harvest, and all for the price of a cheesecake. We didn't pay a dime for it.
Wow.
And we would license those. And eventually, one time, we're traveling in the Netherlands at a event called Grand Gala du Disque, and we met this man called Hubert de Hagen. And Hubert was the manager of a band that was an instrumental Dutch band. And we liked them, and we took them and we put them out on Sire. And then they needed a producer to make the next record. We suggested our partner in Blue Horizon, Mike Vernon. Michael made the record in the UK with them, and on it was a song called Hocus Pocus. And that was really it.
Yeah.
That was a number one that came before all the other ones.
Wow.
So Hocus Pocus by Focus, an instrumental Dutch group.
Wow.
So that's the beginnings. I mean, you guys could take it, from there if you like.
Well, I'd like to talk about exactly Hocus Pocus, because if you remember how we first got together, it was I had seen Seymour talk at a new school course I was taking. Not as good as Richard's courses, but it was
of course not.
1972. So I was at Carnegie Hall for the David Bowie concert of Ziggy Stardust, where he came down from the sky in the crescent moon. At the intermission, standing in line to get to the men's room like everybody else, and I look, and right in front of me is Seymour Stein. And I whisper in his ear, Tice Van Leer, and he goes crazy. And he says, "Who are you? How do you know that name? Where do you come from?" And I told him who I was. "You're that guy that's getting all that airplay on this record? You come to me tomorrow. I want to meet with you." And the next day I was there with Seymour and Richard. And before you know it, we're forming a label called Passport. In fact, Richard was the one who came up with the name Passport. That is sort of what Jem was doing back then. We were breaking records as imports. Lots of records as imports.
Yeah, as imports.
And to give you an idea of what Seymour did, the cheesecake story is perfect, because as I became Seymour and Richard, sort of like they were my mentors, I had to bring the cheesecakes to England and bring them to partners. He didn't want to. I had to bring them over. But I want to give you a
good cheesecakes. The turf cheesecakes.
Yes, juniors. They were juniors cheesecakes, if I remember.
No, they weren't. They
it's only 50 years ago. I mean, why should they?
Marty, they came from Upper Manhattan. There was a bake shop up there. We used to get them. They also were sold at. We found the bake shop because we started eating them at Jack Dempsey's, which was a restaurant in the building that was the Brill Building. And of course, Jack Dempsey, I mean, we all remember him, but ask a kid today who he was the famous heavyweight boxing champion of the world.
Yeah.
So I want to tell you a quick little story about Seymour and Billboard. And Richard, talked about it as mentioning that all the other versions of My Girl Sloopy just disappeared off the Billboard charts. So, as I said, when we started Passport, the idea originally of Passport was for us to find all these bands that we were breaking as imports and license them. And I think the third or fourth band that we got was an English band living in Frankfurt, Germany, on a German label called Nectar. And we were getting an insane amount of airplay on this track called Remember the Future, which actually was a 38-minute track. It was the whole record. And so we put it out. And at that time, Sire and Passport were distributed by Famous Music, which was part of Gulf and Western.
Paramount, Gulf and Western, yeah.
Right. So we put out the record, and what was getting great FM airplay, it was just starting out. But Seymour, as a lot of his deals, he had a deal with Billboard that every week that record would jump 11 spots. 11 spots every single week. By the time an ABC Records, which at that point had taken over for Famous Music, they had bought Famous Music, from Gulf and Western, they were manufacturing records like a bakery. As a matter of fact, there were warehouses full of these records that hadn't sold, but that's another story. So it was going up the charts, 11 spots every single week, until eventually it got into the top 20 with a red bullet that it was gold. Okay? And this whole thing was done between Seymour and a certain person at Billboard. But that's the kind of deals that Seymour would do to help a record.
Let me just say that I could listen to these guys talk all day, and I have my whole life, basically. I worked with Marty from my very first release. I worked with Richard Gottehrer from my first release. These are my family we're talking to. So I'm thrilled to listen to these stories. I love these stories. And Seymour was a great friend and became more of a friend. I knew of Sire as a fan, as a record fan growing up, and I knew from the ABC period. I was a record collector as a kid. At age 7, I started collecting records, and I was on the radio as a DJ at age 7. I was the littlest DJ on AM top 40 station. So I got every release from all the labels, so I could play them on the radio as a kid. See, so I learned all the labels. I learned the producers. I learned about the Strangeloves. As I was in high school, I was interested in the import records that Marty was importing. So all these guys, this is family to me. And Seymour is part of that. I first met him. I knew the records. And then when the new wave scene started, I was already buying the Ramones albums, the Richard Hell album that Richard produced, and also collecting Marty's records all separately, but it all, in some ways, Seymour is a centerpiece for all of these. Seymour was like a connector to all of these people, in a way. Yeah. And I met him at CBGB really early on when I first came to New York from Florida, and just admired that he was in the club scouting still, always, looking for bands. So that to me was very impressive and very important. Now, I didn't sign with him right away because I first did a deal with Marty for the first Bongos album, Drums Along the Hudson. And that was all records we made in England. And then I signed to RCA, and Richard Gottehrer was my producer with the Bongos. Now that's
record too.
Very good. In fact, it's being reissued on September 8th because they were doing a special remastering reissue with 9 bonus tracks.
Wow!
So Legacy, Sony's putting it out. We're doing the album you produced plus a lot of live tracks that we recorded for RCA at the time that were never released.
Right.
That comes out on September 8th. It's the 40th anniversary of Numbers with Wings, and we're doing more this year. And I can't even say because we're doing more new recordings for RCA.
Oh, good.
So I might call you about something.
Glad to hear that because that's a record that got sort of lost.
Yes.
You think that record was lost? Richard, tell them the story about how we got together again in this past decade about the lost record.
Well, we did. We had a lost record, but before that, even I want to tell you that's when I really connected with Seymour. Was when another record I did with Marty Scott was called Cool Blue Halo. I made a solo record away from the Bongos by myself. Yeah, and Seymour liked it and started calling me at home, like, I want to sign you. And I was like, well, let's talk about it. So we had some dinners. We had dinners with Andy Paley and others as potential producers. We were going to do a deal, except that then Marty came back and he had a licensing deal with MCA, and he lured me over to his new label, which was called Paradox. I signed with Paradox, and again, Richard Gottehrer produced that record for me. So you see how it's been a lifelong connection for me.
The circle, and it revolves around Seymour, but
it does. It does.
It just shows you that the business has a center.
I was after Depeche Mode. This is, of course, before they signed with anybody, and I was in England, and I went to see them at, I guess it was some sort of studio in a church. I don't remember exactly where. And they said, Marty, we love you. We want to sign with you, except Seymour's coming in an hour. And if he loves us, we're signing with Sire. I said, okay, sign with Seymour. If you got to sign with anybody else, you sign with Sire, because that's good for me too. And he came an hour later, and the tens of millions of records later, Depeche Mode was with Sire.
One thing he told me, when I was just about, we were talking about signing at this time. This is when I then signed with Marty instead. And Seymour told me about Depeche Mode and told me which made me think and made me maybe not want to sign at that moment, because he said, I got that group for $1 and I never even paid them the $1.
Probably made me pay the $1.
So I'm like, Seymour, I don't know if I want to do this then, because we need to make a record. I need a budget.
Okay, before you cut off, you got to bring up one thing. You mentioned Clive Davis, who's a wonderful creative, and he was a genius in the business.
Yeah,
but that isn't the root of it. Okay, you can't end this without going to the root of what really made Seymour what he was in the music business. We forget these people, but Sid Nathan, King Records, he was not just a mentor, but he learned how to manipulate and do things from him. He also learned from Leonard Chess. These are people that, before the business was booming, as independents came into it and built something fresh. And they built them from forms of music that make up the music that's truly American music. The blues, R&B, country music, the music of the Black culture, the music of Irish and Scottish people that came into the country. And some came willingly, some forcibly, but whatever came out of it was a culture that's so rich and is spread throughout the world.
Wow.
And that's what we should remember.
I listened to a couple of interviews with Seymour, and one of the things that stood out for me, that Seymour, in his own words, he says, I don't play an instrument, I don't sing, but what I do have is an ear. That's what was given to me, was that ear. So rightly so, we know that he has that ear.
I know he had a lot of fights with Warner Brothers. They didn't understand the Ramones, right? And they didn't understand.
Well, they didn't understand them, and hardly anybody understood them when we signed the Ramones. They didn't think they were very good. I mean, if you're going to judge musicianship, what's the levels? But he did have fights. The other fights he had was, he would talk to me about going to China to find music from Asia.
Wow.
We talk about India. So he takes a trip. He says, Richard, I'm going to go to Australia. And there he found a song that we put out, the Push Bike song, which was actually the first hit on Sire. But on the way, he went to China. So he meets somebody on the plane and they start talking. And the guy is Chinese, but he says, I'm going to celebrate Hanukkah or something, one of the holidays. And he said, you're going to celebrate Hanukkah? And he says, I'm Jewish too. So the Chinese gentleman said to him, please come to my house and we'll celebrate together. Seymour immediately says, oh my God, I love Chinese food. Oh, this is the best I've ever had. He shows up at the house. What's there? Stuffed cabbage, all the cooked chicken, all the things he would find at his mother's house at a Sabbath meal.
That's funny.
And so we learned a lesson from that. But
great story.
The world, he was always interested in the world. When we started Sire, the idea was to be global, and that made me want to make the Orchard global.
Right.
And you did so great with the Orchard. You really started a whole revolution, Richard.
Yeah, it was a revolution. Now it's endless. It's huge.
It's
50
fantastic.
offices around the world. But if I trace back to the steps that Seymour and I took, we then took it again with my partner Scott Cohen, realizing the world's a lot bigger than of the music business than we anticipated is coming from here.
Now for the next group of people paying tribute to Seymour Stein. We'll start off with Chris Frantz, American musician, record producer for Talking Heads and Tom Tom Club, founded with Tina Weymouth. In 2002, inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of Talking Heads, author of the book Remain in Love. Craig Leone, American record producer, composer, and arranger at Sire Records, helped launch careers on Sire, recording artists such as Ramones and Talking Heads. He was very involved as producer in the first Ramones album. Monte A. Melnick, tour manager of the Ramones and author of book On the Road with the Ramones, noted in Please Kill Me article, Fifth Ramones Speaks in 2018. So let's start with Chris Frantz. Have any, tell us some gossip, Seymour Stein gossip.
Well, I had a personal email from Mandy Stein today. Does that count?
Yeah, definitely does.
she's doing very well.
Good.
And she's happy to hear that we're paying tribute to her dad. Yeah. I'm gonna see her in, let's see, September 19th in Los Angeles. We're doing a premiere for the newly restored and remixed version of Stop Making Sense. So we're happy about that. I met Seymour at CBGB's. I mean, Didn't we all meet Seymour at CBGB's? Yeah. I think so. Maybe not. But anyway, he came to he came to a show where we were opening for the Ramones, and he was there to see the Ramones. Right. He's told this story himself many times, so I'll paraphrase it. But he was standing outside of CBGB's with Lenny Kaye,
right,
waiting for the Ramones to go on, and Talking Heads started to play. It was maybe our third or fourth show ever. We had not done very many shows, and we started up, and the opening act was supposed to have been a band called the Shirts, but I think they got a paying gig out on Long Island somewhere, a better paying gig, so that we got the slot, and we began playing, and Seymour heard us begin to play, and he said to Lenny, "That's not the Shirts. That doesn't sound like it." And Lenny said, "No, that's Talking Heads." And he went in to see us, and he really liked it. Evidently, we were still a three-piece at the time, Tina and David and myself, and very nervous but excited to be playing at CBGB's. When we finished our little set, I mean, in those days, sets were like 20 minutes to a half hour long. Is that right, Monty? Something like that. Well, especially the Ramones.
They had 30 songs in that.
Went by really quickly. But Seymour saw us play. He really liked it. And he at the end of the show, he came up to the stage, and he tried to help Tina take her bass amp down off of the stage. She was like, no, Seymour, I can handle this. And he said, "Do you know who I am? I'm Seymour Stein from Sire Records." And we said, oh, great. Nice to meet you, Seymour. And he basically, he wanted to sign us on the spot. And we said, well, Seymour, now's not really the time to talk business because we have to load out all this gear. But how about if you call us tomorrow? So he called us the next day. He came down to our terrible loft on Christie Street, seemed fairly unfazed by the conditions we lived in. But he offered us a record deal, and just like that. And we said, but Seymour, we're not ready. We don't feel like we're ready to make a record yet, because we'd made some recordings and we felt like, these are interesting and everything, and they're kind of eccentric sounding, but it's not the type of thing that bears repeated listenings. And, when you make a record, you want people to listen to it more than once. So we said, Seymour, please just be patient. But he kept calling us like every week. Are are you ready to do it now? Are you ready to go into the studio? And we made him wait for like 18 months. God bless him. He hung in there with us. And I think he was really worried that some other record company would be interested. And some were. Some young A&R men and stuff were very interested, but their bosses weren't interested. But at Sire, Seymour was the boss. So he eventually, on November 1st of 1976, we signed a deal with him. I remember asking Danny Fields and also Lenny Kaye beforehand, you think we should really go through with this with Seymour? And Danny Fields said something to the effect that, no record company is perfect, but I can tell you that Seymour will always try to do right by you. So, which is what I believe he had done with the Ramones.
Yeah.
And so we made the deal with Seymour, and I'm so happy we did, because, the type of band we were, it was really good to have an independent record company that was small, and we could go uptown to 74th Street where the Sire townhouse was, and we could hang out and actually talk to the president of the record company. You couldn't do that at Warner Brothers or CBS. I mean, maybe Randy Newman could talk to Mo Austin, but, we went into the studio with this producer that Seymour had some relationship with, Tony Bon Jovi, and thankfully the engineer was a guy named Ed Stasium, who was fantastic.
Yeah. He
had worked with a lot of people, not the least of which were Gladys Knight and the Pips. So we thought, this is the guy who mixed Midnight Train to Georgia. Okay, I guess he's all right. Oh, wait, before we even finished making the record, we were invited by the Ramones to open a tour for them in Europe and the UK in May and June of 1977. And Sire's distributors in Europe underwrote the tour so that we were able to do it. And it was, Monte can tell you, it was a fantastic tour. And it was really Seymour who had the idea that we should go together. And it was so great. Sold out every night. If not sold out, very nearly sold out. And the kids went nuts. In those days in Europe, people were really looking to New York and CBGBs in particular for what was hip and what was cool. So the promoters could just say, band from New York, CBGBs. And that's all they had to put on the poster. And the place would pretty much sell out.
Wow.
With very young, enthusiastic fans of punk and what would later be called New Wave. We did that tour. It was an enormous success critically and I think historically. And then we came back, finished our record, got married, Tina and I, in June of 1977. Seymour came to the wedding with Linda down in Kentucky. I'm like, Seymour, you sure you want to come down to Kentucky? He said, yeah, I can tie it in with a trip to my old stomping ground in Cincinnati when I used to work for King Records. And he did that. He visited Cincinnati. All of this combined led to us having a real, I would say, emotional attachment to Seymour. Like Danny Fields said, no record company is perfect, but some are more perfect than others. And for us, Seymour and Sire Records, it was a perfect match.
Greg Leone, tell us some stories, some really great Seymour stories.
Well, see, the thing is, everybody thinks about Seymour from the time of the Ramones and Talking Heads and onward, Madonna and the later things that he done, which are all fabulous achievements. But Sire existed for quite a while. before all the new wave, quote unquote. He invented that term. He didn't invent the term, but he invented that term to apply to what everybody else was calling punk in New York, which was actually the downtown music because of the black and white new wave French cinema, resemblance, audio, verite, shall we say, that was going on. But in any case, Sire was always, when I first got there, there was no New York scene yet that the label was aware of. But he always went for artists that he actually believed in, or that Richie believed in, who was Richard Gottehrer, who was his partner at the time. And he would trust the people that he'd hired to talk to him about what they were seeing musically and everything. And he'd go behind each one of those artists with his full intent. And so he signed some remarkable, talented people and some very esoteric people early on. And this is something that he should also be remembered by. He made 2 fabulous albums with the American folk singer Gene Ritchie that I don't think anybody's ever heard, but they're phenomenal records, and they're true American folklore tradition. Seymour loved folk music and American country and R&B roots music, which is what King Records actually was. When he was a kid, he went to work for this notorious guy, Sid Nathan, who was one of the old-time record business thieves, but who also got millions of great, not millions, but hundreds, shall we say, of great artists' records released and got their careers going. And he concentrated on R&B and on country music. And Seymour, if you'd ever gone to lunch with Seymour and a group of people, or dinner or anything with Seymour, usually, there would be some singing of R&B and folk music, particularly Vernon Dalhart, the Prisoner's Song, which was one of his favorites, B-side of a record, the old 97. But Seymour was that type of collector that had a tremendous encyclopedia in his mind. And he was hoping in his own way, and he had told me at one point that he was hoping in his way to add to that tradition of American music.
Craig, I want to add that I worked on an album called Rockabilly Rebel, and it was rockabilly
Colin
music.
No.
Yeah, it was rockabilly music, but he was way ahead of his time. You know what I mean? Like Brian Setzer comes in years later with it, just knocks everybody out. But Seymour had the ear for that. You know, he was thinking way ahead, right? I mean, the album didn't really do anything, but it was rockabilly. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, Seymour, if it was a good record, he'd stand behind it, and it didn't really matter. I mean, you kind of realize at the time, and Chris will know this, went through it, and we went through it with the Ramones. Anything that wasn't straight down the middle, even more so than now, wasn't going to get AM radio action on their first album, maybe not on their second album, maybe not on their third album. You'd have to go for a long, long time. You wouldn't be expecting to go for a hit right off the bat. You would be trying to establish the band's identity or the artist's identity and have their audience grow. And Seymour nurtured that with the artist. I don't think, well, he didn't have the money to go ahead and do all the necessary financial things you needed to do to get a hit in those days. And certainly the material that he was being presented with wasn't a hit yet. It was potentially, very important bands and very big hit-making bands. But he would stand behind it. And it goes all the way back to, things like the Pink Fairies that he signed, and stuff when Sire was distributed by London. That might have been the first punk band ever to be released on an American label.
That's a great story.
But in the psychedelic era. So I think the greatest thing to remember about him was his breadth of musical and sociological knowledge, and also his intense desire to try and get all of this radical music on the radio, which was no mean feat in those days.
Monty, how about it?
Well, the Ramones approached with Seymour a different way, because the original managers of the Ramones were Danny Fields and Linda Stein. Of course, Linda Stein was married to Seymour.
Right.
So originally, Lisa Robinson came to Danny and said, "You got to go see this group, the Ramones." And Danny said, "Well, I'm not going to see a cha-cha band, a Mexican band." You know, he didn't like the name. That was the problem with the Ramones in the beginning. People thought they were a Mexican, a Spanish band, or they were all brothers. You know, I mean, we had to fight that for a while. But Lisa Robinson went to Danny, and Danny was very good friends with Linda Stein. And Linda Stein went to see the Ramones, fell in love with them, and then went to Seymour and said, "You got to come and see the group. You know, they're unbelievable. They're terrific." So Seymour finally, he couldn't come to the Ramones CBGB show. He actually booked a studio for them, and they played for him, and he just fell in love with them. And he was so behind the band. It was incredible the way he loved the band. He really loved the band. So when we first started touring, basically, the Sire Records had a white van, and he lent it to us. And here's a picture of it right there.
Ah. Mm-hmm.
It's a white van. He lent it to the Ramones in the beginning because he loved the Ramones, and that helped us a lot. You know, we pulled around a U-Haul with it, and he really tried to help the band really break through the American radio, which was difficult at the time, you know, because with the Sex Pistols out, the radio didn't really want to get involved with like punk at the time, so they were kind of ignoring the Ramones radio play. That's the big problem we had. So the Ramones became a touring band basically in the States, you know. Of course, in England, things were different over there because they had the great music papers and the radio stations were playing the Ramones. So they became a little bigger in the overseas than in the United States at the time. Of course, the 1977 tour with the Talking Heads was fantastic. Chris, was really unbelievable breakthrough for the Ramones and Talking Heads. I remember we didn't have a tour bus. It was kind of like a school bus, right? Everybody's on one. It wasn't even a tour bus with beds. It's just like a school bus type of thing. So we're traveling around in that type of bus. So basically, Seymour was terrific. Every time I bumped into him or met him, he was really friendly and supportive of the band. And it was just terrific being around him. So he was a wonderful person, very knowledgeable.
Risa Morley, former assistant at Sire Records to the famous Seymour Stein, then A&R manager, director, VP International, A&R Sire, Sire Electra, Sire Recording Group, and London Sire. Andy Paley, American songwriter, producer, composer, and formed the Paley brothers on Sire Records, staff producer at Sire Records. Anthony DeCurtis, American author, music critic, writes for Rolling Stone, New York Times, Relix, and other publications. Best-selling New York Times nonfiction author for Clive Davis autobiography, The Soundtrack of My Life, and author of the book Lou Reed A Life, a biography of Lou Reed, who was signed to Sire Records, and Seymour is also mentioned in Anthony's book. He served as member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominating committee for over 20 years. Let's start with Risa. Tell us some Seymour gossip.
You know, I was talking to Andy yesterday, and I was saying, how do you fit like an ocean into a thimble? But Seymour used to call me the Sphinx because I would never repeat any really secret stories about him. But I do have a lot of good stories about Seymour, of course, because when I met him, I was about 21 years old when I started working at Sire. And, you know, at Sire, you really had to get along with Seymour because it was your life. I lived, breathed everything Sire for, you know, at least 15 years. And you never knew where the day was going to take you, who was going to come into the office, who was even going to call. You know, sometimes we thought we were getting prank calls when like Madonna would call, especially when James, the first time James Brown called the office, I really thought I was being pranked. Seymour was like, of course I know James Brown, put him through. But, you know, I one thing really sticks out in my mind was, you know, because Seymour was also the president of the Hall of Fame. And the very first year I was working for Seymour, he spent, days writing his speech. And even though he was, such a prolific writer and amazing giving speeches, he was surprisingly nervous when he would kind of get up and have to give a speech. And he spent, days writing the Hall of Fame speech. And it was the first year I was with him for it. And finally, we needed to go over to the Waldorf. And we get there, we're very late. Everything's a big tumult and flurry with Seymour usually. And we get there, and it was January 16th, 1991. And Ahmet gets up on stage and says, the U.S. and their allies have just gone to war. This was before cell phones. We don't know anything going on. And I knew Seymour was going to get up and have to give his speech that he was kind of unhappy with. So Seymour got up and he took his prepared speech and kind of ripped it up and threw it up in the air and said, some people said tonight should be canceled, but this is rock and roll and the show must go on. Wow. And he was inducting Ralph Bass that year, and he said he was going to talk about unsung A&R people. And, this was the year that all of these people were getting in. They've been working their whole lives for this, and it's rock and roll, and we're going to do it. And it was so great because I was so happy that he wasn't giving the speech that he really hated. And, he said he was totally unprepared, but of course gave an incredible speech. And he did an impression of Sid Nathan, threw in a couple of curse words, sang a little bit, and then did the induction. Oh. And it was just like, typical, amazing Seymour. He was such a champion too, where he would find bands when there was no bidding war, and he loved that the most, was signing them. Wow. When he got inducted into the Hall of Fame, it was the most incredible night. He gave an amazing speech, and Ice-T inducted him. And I think it was one of the top 10 inductions of all time. And Seymour loved Ice, and Ice-T, had said so many times that when Seymour met him, he reminded him of Bob Dylan, which who would ever put Ice-T and Bob Dylan together except Seymour? And, on more recent videos of Ice-T, giving tribute to Seymour after he passed away, Ice-T said Seymour saved his life, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Seymour, I thought about this call and we're paying tribute to him. And the thing that is mind-blowing to me about Seymour, when I met him and when I got to know him, is his... he was I would say he was one of the best song men I've ever met. And I've met a lot of guys who know songs. Seymour's life was songs. I've seen him with Phil Spector. I've seen him with Jerry Wexler. I've seen him with Jerry Lee Lewis. I've seen him with Brian Wilson. I've seen him with people who have the same kind of respect for songwriters that he did, but his knowledge was unbelievable. Starting his knowledge of songs, starting in the 19th century, late 19th century, all the way to, let's say, 1970, where it gets a little bit foggy. But he really, really loved songs. That's what he cared about more than anything. And those of us who hung around with him know that, he would sing. I mean, Seymour's his singing voice was whatever it was, but he knew lyrics, and he could remember lyrics better than just about anybody I've ever met. Wow. And that's the thing that just stands out more than anything. And personally, he helped me and my brother start making records as a team. And his legacy is obviously going to, I mean, he's left us an amazing body of work. If you look at everything that he had to do with, everything that he signed, everything that he was involved with, it's pretty amazing. I mean, the other thing that's great is that's really that he would be so proud and happy about is that Mandy, his daughter, is doing so well, and so she's really shown. I mean, between Seymour and Linda, she's ended up with this incredible passion for music, and she's producing movies now. She did a great Dean Martin movie and a Velvet Underground movie, and
Right.
and she was working with Fat Possum Records. I mean, she's really passionate about it, and
Yeah.
I know he was really proud of her, and that's
Yeah.
something that's really great. And of course, Linda had a lot to do with that too, because the environment that she and Samantha grew up in was pretty amazing. Just you've got Ellie Greenwich coming over to the house. You've got people like that, and I benefited greatly from knowing Seymour and Linda, and all the people that I'm thinking of that also benefited, like the Ramones and Katie Lang and Madonna, and everyone, Freddie DeMann, Jimmy Iovine. I mean, you could just drop names forever.
Yeah.
But he was kind of the center that we all ended up talking to at least a few times a week, and there was a reason for that. And he was he was always interested in what everybody else was doing.
Anthony DeCurtis, your book, Lou Reed Life, which ties in with Sire, and you wrote about Seymour in the book, and of course it's a great book to buy. Tell us, Anthony, about Seymour that you know.
Well, I know Seymour primarily through the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominating committee, which, as you sort of mentioned, I've been on since the early 90s and continue to be. Seymour, what I really liked about him, although not everyone did, I will, to be honest, is that when Seymour spoke at those meetings, he there was a lot of jockeying. I mean, everybody that you think would be in that room was in that room, and there was a lot of awareness of how you were going to be perceived and how you might be perceived. Whereas Seymour always spoke as a fan. He never seemed to be like angling, for whoever he may have worked with or whatever. He so often returned to things that he liked when he was a kid, and that were often being overlooked. Because as been mentioned here, his knowledge was encyclopedic, and he really wanted recognition for certain doo-wop groups and early R&B groups who, people just, there was much more of a kind of a recognition of the sort of, I guess this great 60s artists, so going back beyond that, outside the realm of the hard blues, which was recognized. Seymour was really attempting to get recognition for those artists. And yeah, he would make a case that was very passionate, talk about the songs, Sandy mentioned, would often sing, and would often, the case was something that was very personal to him, not because of business, but because the music shaped him. And he wanted these people to be seen and recognized by a larger audience. And so there was a sense, though, often, Seymour, because of that, was, it was just like, oh, okay, here goes Seymour, among some people. But I remember there was one time there was this business issue that came up, which, you know, I certainly wasn't adept at speaking out. It wasn't anything that I knew very much about. And suddenly Seymour turned into the guy who has run record companies for decades. Just spoke like so directly and forthrightly and clearly about what needed to be done. Like, wow, like that's an aspect of this person I've never really seen before. You know, I mean, it makes sense that it was there, but you know, it was always very interesting that to me that he had both those things in his back pocket. You know, just this, you know, this smart business sense, but also this incredible passion, you know, going back to his youngest days. And both of those things seemed like very, very accessible to him. And it was extremely impressive.
Also, it's interesting, your two books, one on Clive Davis, the other one, Lou Reed, of course, but Seymour's involved. But it's like those were two major music execs, right? I mean, Clive Davis and Seymour Stein, you're going to put them together in some way.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, Lou was great. I mean, Lou talked about Seymour. You know, they got along, obviously. It was a big deal for him when he got signed to Sire, and he made, you know, the New York album there, which was a kind of a comeback record for him.
Yeah.
And I think he was, you know, appreciative of Seymour's support. Everyone there knew that Seymour cared about him. And I think Lou, you know, very much appreciated that. And yeah, you know, look, Clive was, you know, Clive obviously, you know, works in his own realm. I mean, he's still out there doing his thing, you know. And people ask me, you know, why, you know, how was Clive, you know, managed to survive so long? It's just, he loves his life, you know, really loves his life.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but, you know, obviously they're, you know, they're of that same sort of stature. And, you know, when Clive goes, I mean, that may be the last one of that entire generation of people.
I'd just like to thank everybody for being on in this very special interview.
I just want to say how I think we're just so lucky, all of us, to have had some. I mean, I probably had the least connection with Seymour, but I did have a connection with him. But just everyone that had anything to do with Seymour, we're just so lucky to have had that time with this genius of a music man. You know, he was just a remarkable, you know, discoverer of music that, you know, the average person at the time that he discovered them, people like the Ramones and the Talking Heads, weren't. So, you know, we, the public, didn't hear what Seymour would hear. And then ultimately we caught up to Seymour.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if another person today lives or exists that we can compare to Seymour. I don't think there is somebody like him. But
let's hope. Let's hope.
Yeah, let's hope. But I'm just grateful to have had a connection to Seymour. And thank you to all of you who, you know, we this is a tribute to him and his life, and a small tribute. But thank you to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to end the show by saying we remember Seymour.